Questions are being asked in the United States about just how the 8th biggest hurricane of all time is going to hit Tampa this very evening. People talk about a weather weapon, about the manipulation of the climate. Although, of course, the United States themselves are the pioneers in this. I reckon the Russians done it. If not the Russians, then the Iranians. They must know a thing or two about hurricanes. After all, they had an earthquake in the Iranian desert just the other day. Oh wait, that was the testing of a nuclear weapon. A nuclear weapon that renders them henceforth invulnerable to large-scale Israeli or American attack, unless everyone involved wants to see the end of the world. If you're one of those who doesn't, I recommend watching for only the 4th time ever since it was made in 1984, only the 4th time ever, the televising of the movie Threads. Once you've watched it, or once you've read the foreword of Nuclear War, a scenario, as I talked about just the other week, you'll know that only the stark raving mad would embark down a road that could lead to nuclear conflagration. But then the lunatics have taken control of the asylums in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin, and other vassals are available. The weather event in the United States is, of course, an entirely natural phenomenon. And it's not the biggest, it's the 8th biggest. If the Russians had done it, they would have made it the biggest one of all. Given the last 2.5 years, the Russians have become rather accomplished at storms. They're storming the Ukrainian lines along the front line in the Donbass this very evening. Stand by for important breaking news on that. But according to the head of MI5, about which I'm going to take a few minutes, even though I know that MI5 is not the biggest issue for people in the United States who toil under the anvil of the FBI, of the CIA, of the NSA, and an alphabet soup of oppressive state machineries, we've always had a kind of love-hate relationship with our intelligence services. They were the very epitome of bumbling upper-class Englishness. They took communist agents, Soviet agents, into their ranks and promoted them again and again until they were at the deputy head of both MI5 and MI6, and who knows, maybe even the heads themselves. They do play an important role. I'm not one of those who's against having an intelligence agency. I just want it to be intelligent. And I'm now asking how it can be that the head of Britain's Internal Security Service, MI5, can possibly believe that the mayhem on British streets is a result of Russian meddling. I really want to know if he really believes that. Because if he really believes that, he's too stupid to be the head of MI5. If he doesn't really believe it, but he's saying it for some nefarious purpose, he's too wicked to be the head of MI5. So we're asked to believe that youths chasing each other in the streets of London and other big cities with machetes, with swords, the people who are stabbing and shooting other young people in the London Underground, outside the London Underground, outside schools, on bikes, in the streets of the United Kingdom, are doing so at the behest of Vladimir Putin. Happy birthday, Mr. President, 72 years young this week. Do you really think the Russians are behind the massive drugs trade in Britain? which mainly comes from Kosovo, the territory liberated by Tony Blair and feted and cosseted ever since by Western governments and by NATO. Do you really believe that the profusion of drugs and guns and vice on the streets of Britain is because of the Russians? Do you really think it's the Russians who are allowing thousands of people every single day, people we don't know, have no papers, and are usually young men of fighting age? Is that the Russians that are unleashing this mayhem onto the streets of Britain? If you believe that, you are certifiably mad. And I don't think most British people believe it at all. I don't think the British people believe that the Russians are the reason that we are ruled by a block of wood with less empathy than a block of wood, a catatonic, robotic man who couldn't inspire his own children, either with his own wife or somebody else's wife, to cross the road at his behest. Is that the Russians to blame? Is it the Russians that are to blame for the fact that Her Majesty's opposition are about to choose between some jerk called Jenrick that nobody in the country has ever heard of, that I, who spent almost 40 years in the British Parliament, have never set eyes on, have never heard speak, or Kemi Badenough? Have you seen, heard Kemi Badenough? They're the two going into the final ballot to lead the British opposition, potentially to be the British Prime Minister. Is that the Russians that are to blame for that? Is it the Russians that are to blame for the fact that in this cold winter coming up, your grandma, grandpa has had their cold weather allowance withdrawn? Is it the Russians that are to blame for the fact that every third and fourth child in Britain is now left to fend for themselves without any state support? Is that the doing of the Russians? Is it the Russians to blame for the fact that Britain's railway system is so broken it takes you an entire day and a king's ransom to travel from one end of this island to the other? Is it the Russians to blame that the lifts are never working, that the escalators are never working, that the streets are never swept, that the bins are overflowing, that poverty stalks the land, that the public realm is falling to pieces? Is that because of the Russians? Mr. MI5, do you really believe that? If you don't believe it, why did you say it? What do you have planned that you're going to blame on the Russians? Of course, it's not only the Russians. Now the Iranians are in the frame. You could go your entire life in Britain without ever meeting a single Russian or a single Iranian. And yet, according to the head of MI5, the Russians and the Iranians are everywhere, hatching fiendish plots which are thwarted by the James Bonds, shall I call them, of MI5? Or is it Mr. Beans of MI5? Is Mr. Bean in MI5 Tower ever going to tell us which plots were thwarted by his men and women? Fiendish plots, hatched by Iranians, by Russians, but conveniently he's unable to tell us about them. Even so that we can marvel at Mr. Bean, at Mrs. Bean, at how they managed to foil these fiendish plots. Is there anybody out there in Britain who still believes this guff? Seriously, I'm asking, I'm testing the intelligence quotient of the nation, my nation. in which I live, the nationality which my children enjoy. I want to know, how stupid are we? Are we stupid enough to believe that what he called the mayhem on the streets of Britain was really being sown by the Russians and the Iranians? This, of course, was all given big licks on the so-called mainstream media. But the best news I heard today is that Sky News is closing down. A nation rejoices. Not until the last Sky News broadcaster chokes on their last Sky News bulletin will I be truly happy. The newspapers are defunct, are being kept alive by billionaires entirely for nefarious purposes, partly so they could be endlessly reviewed on Sky News and on other news broadcasts. Only 14% of people under 30 in Britain ever watch BBC News. 14% ever watch BBC News. They'll be the ones that definitely are not stupid enough to believe that a man with snow on his boots, in a fur hat, with a vodka bottle in his back pocket, is roaming around Britain, causing mayhem on our streets. It's Vlad that took the tights off the poor, ill-clad girls walking around in the bitter cold in Glasgow and Newcastle. It's Vlad that's behind teenage pregnancies, record divorce rates. It's Vlad that is causing our population to fall just at the moment when we are preparing to put our old age pensioners who have survived the cold snap into a capsule injected by lethal drugs, hurrying them on to their graves in the name of dignity in dying. It's all the fault of the Russians. You know, during the Cold War, when people were considerably more thick than they are now, when they had no choice but to rely on the 2 and then 3 news broadcasts, no other source of news was accessible by anybody. When people had no alternative media, you could come up to a podium in Whitehall as Mr. Chief Bean Counter and tell people that the Russians were coming. But here's something you don't want to hear, Mr. Chief Bean Counter. There are millions of people here in Britain who wish the Russians were coming because they see Russia as a very much more successful country than ours. A country whose economy is booming, whose prestige is large and becoming larger. A united country of many nationalities, colors and creeds. A country that its people can be proud of, rather than a country of which many, if not most of us, are increasingly ashamed. Now let me turn to another reason for our shame. In Akrotiri in Cyprus, we have a sovereign Air Force base. Let's not get into how we can be sovereign in a part of somebody else's country. It was part of the treaty of the independence of Cyprus. Let's not go into the fact that what did Britain have to do with Cyprus? Why did we ever own Cyprus? How could we ever deny independence to the Cypriots? But we did. But they fought us out. But the price of us leaving was for a sovereign Air Force base at Akrotiri. This is where you, Mr. MI6, better tune in, because I'm about to threaten your vital interests. The terms of that treaty, and I have read it, are that we may maintain at Akrotiri in Cyprus a military base for defensive purposes. But you, twisters, fork-tongued liars, are using Cypriot territory not for defensive purposes, but for the deeply offensive purpose of helping Benjamin Netanyahu slaughter people in Lebanon, slaughter people in Gaza. You are flying our Royal Air Force daily, either over Gaza, over Lebanon, or directly to Tel Aviv. Military transport planes that the House of Commons has been denied, officially denied, knowledge of what's in those planes, who's in those planes. You get me here? Not just Cypriot sovereignty is being abused by this current British government, but British sovereignty is being abused. They're our planes, not yours. If you want to be strictly particular about it, those planes belong to King Charles III. Have you asked him? Have you told him what's in his Royal Air Force planes? What are his planes doing over the Lebanon, over the Gaza Strip? Because you never know. He, unlike you, might even have been moved by the wholesale slaughter of women and children by Netanyahu's gangster regime, which you are openly cavorting in breach of our and of Cypriot sovereignty in the grisly death dance that you're all playing against the people of the Middle East. Some things, of course, never change. You're still murdering Yemenis. I'm 70 years old. All of my life until this day, you have been murdering people in Yemen. You're jolly lucky, you know, that they never hit you back. You're jolly lucky, Mr. MI5, that they are never on London Bridge. You're jolly lucky, Mr. MI6, that they're not out hunting for your agents, because I would be. If you'd been killing me for 70 years, I would hate you with such a vengeance that I would be determined that revenge would be mine. We are jolly lucky in this sceptred isle of ours, that we are protected by water all around us. Unfortunately, our armed forces being put in harm's way by a cruel, vindictive, and stupid government, served by even more stupid intelligence services, they may not be quite so lucky. Fasten your seatbelts. Low keys coming up. It is the mother of all talk shows.